I suppose in one way or another, you could almost title any musical program dramatic soundscapes, because one of the main objects of music is to make some kind of dramatic statement, and also to play on the idea of the interplay of dramatic characters within musical works. So even if you can think of some musical pieces that you think, oh, well, they're not dramatic at all, they're so slight. You know, any piece of Webern, for example, something dramatic about a work of Webern might be that it lasts for 9 seconds, you know? Or you could say the opposite end of the spectrum, string quartet of Morton Feldman that lasts for 6 hours. And perhaps none of the gestures that the performers make themselves on a local scale are all that dramatic. But after 6 hours, the statement is quite a dramatic statement of heft and scale. So in some way or another, I think almost all music attempts to get at some type of dramatic statement. So this idea of calling a program dramatic soundscapes, it could be almost any program that you could label that. For Prokofiev, particularly, I was thinking about the ideas that Prokofiev was interested in from a storytelling standpoint and from a narrative standpoint. So much of his music is so incredibly evocative and full of images, and goes really well with images. I always thought if Prokofiev were alive during the time of Harry Potter, that he would have been employed to write the music for all of those films, because his imagination is so attuned to the idea of fantasy and fairy tale. If you can think of some stories that Prokofiev was interested in, like Cinderella or Romeo and Juliet, you know, the idea of storytelling and fairy tale is really right up his alley. So in this piece that we're going to play tonight, the F minor violin sonata, he's telling a story, and I don't know how much of a fairy tale it is, or how much of a grim tale that it might be, about a reflection of the society in which he lived, especially in the era under Stalin. There's a lot of nationalistic Russian folk ideas in the piece, but there are also probably akin to a lot of Shostakovich works, also written for the violinist David Oistrakh, some type of possibly subversive element going on underneath the surface of what seem to be very nationalistic and proud Russian folk tunes. So this work is, in a way, it's kind of a difficult downer of an ender for a program, but it is hefty and huge and wonderful, so we hope you enjoy listening to that in the second half. Similar to Prokofiev, who also traveled quite a bit in his life, Szymanowski was influenced by a lot of traveling that he did. He traveled a lot in North Africa. He traveled a lot in the Middle East. You know, Szymanowski was originally from Poland, and probably one of the most well-known Polish composers of the 20th century, certainly one of the first well-known Polish composers of the 20th century. But he wasn't totally interested in only being Polish. He was also interested in bringing in exotic elements to his music. He was also interested, like Prokofiev, in the idea of telling stories. Szymanowski was also interested in the idea of ancient stories, old myths. He wrote a set of 3 myths for violin and piano that are beautifully, impressionistically rendered, wonderful, amazing pieces. The romance that we're going to play for you tonight was actually written much earlier than those myths. The romance was written in 1910, and it's actually much more expressionistic than impressionistic. And expressionistic, if you think about romanticism and the idea of dissonance creating some kind of expression, well, the expressionistic movement sort of continues that romantic movement, but pushes it even further. So you'll hear in the romance that there's a lot of dissonance, which is used for expressive purposes. And he saturates his piece with dissonance, so it almost sounds like you're in a jungle listening to these themes. And he also juxtaposes in a very dramatic way. He juxtaposes tonal centers that are not normally juxtaposed. So you'll hear the very opening theme played at the beginning of the romance, and then almost immediately that opening theme is transposed into a different key, and it sort of has this effect of being, whoa, this is extremely ecstatic. This is an extremely ecstatic experience. So for the romance, he could also have maybe titled it Ecstasy. The first half of the program, I thought it would be really fun to pair Mozart and Carter, especially because Elliott Carter, often refers to Mozart as an interest of his or an influence of his compositional thought, especially Mozart opera. Carter really likes the idea in Mozart opera of dramatic irony. So there can be multiple characters on the stage, all telling things to the audience simultaneously, and the audience can hear very specifically what each of those characters is saying, but the characters on the stage don't know what one another is saying. So that's a very classic textbook definition of dramatic irony. And Carter was really, really interested in that because for Mozart to have achieved multiple perspectives happening simultaneously, Carter thought, wow, that's really amazing. One of Carter's 20th century interests is Sergei Eisenstein. He's a great Soviet filmmaker. And if you've ever seen the battleship Potemkin, there's this one scene in the movie, it's pretty horrible, where you see a baby carriage, there's lots of chaos outside. There's a baby carriage falling down a set of steps. And the way that Eisenstein films it is cross-cut technique. So you see the baby carriage, and then bam, it cuts away to another scene of a bunch of people talking. And then bam, back to the baby carriage. And then bam, a different scene of people kind of going hysterical, and there's fire and smoke rising. And bam, back to the baby carriage. Carter is really, really interested in the idea of cross-cutting in order to achieve this sense that multiple things are all going on simultaneously. So in the Riconoscneza that I'm going to play for you tonight, you're going to hear basically 3 different character types. There's a character type called scorrevole, which means kind of flowing and scurrying. And that's all over the violin, up really high, down really low, and lots of really big leaps and kind of crazy, unexpected intervals. Then there's a second character type, and he calls it giocosamente and martellato. So very marked, and at the same time very joyous. It's kind of a paradox and really hard to play and make sense of that. And there's lots of minor seconds in that one. So it's an extreme contrast from the flowing scorrevole character that you hear at the beginning. And then the third character that happens is a tranquillo character. And I like to think of it as almost a non-character, or this idea of music of the spheres, where you hear long held notes, often 2 notes at a time. And they're usually thirds or tenths, but sometimes they're also fourths and fifths. So you'll hear this back and forth cross-cutting, and you'll realize also, maybe subconsciously, you might realize that when he picks up an old character after it has been interrupted by one of these other crosscuts, he picks up with the same pitches or the same intervals that he left off that previous character. So it really does seem like a crosscut. And the more times you listen to it and the more times you play it, you start to notice, whoa, I could just play this whole thing straight through and then interlay these other things in between. So you can see how Carter's thinking and how he's trying to achieve the sense of depicting multiple realities all at the same time. It's really difficult for Carter to achieve, and it's also really fun to play. So I hope you enjoy the Riconoscneza.